Okay, hello and welcome. I'm Jason Gumpert from MSDynamicsWorld.com, and we are here for a new session in our Fall 2014 Financial Automation webcast series. Today we have a real treat as we welcome Bill Macbeth back to join us. Bill is the Chief Research Officer at ChainLink Research, and he's here today to share his latest views on direct materials Procure-to-Pay. I just want to add that we do invite you to add your feedback and ask questions during Bill's presentation. I'd also like to just recognize our Financial Automation webcast series sponsors and thank them for their support. They are Avalara, Bottom Line Technologies, Metafile, Perceptive Software, and ReadSoft. So as we get started, please know that you can use the Q&A block that you see to the right of the slides, as well as the chat, to ask your questions. Bill will save some time at the end to answer those. And without further delay, please let me hand it off now to Bill Macbeth.
Great, thanks, Jason. It's great to be here. And for those of you who are not familiar with ChainLink, we're an analyst firm that really focuses on supply chain issues, and that includes procurement, sourcing and procurement, as well as one of the things we cover. We do both work for the end user community and helping them improve their supply chain practices, and for solution providers and software companies. We like to make sure that our advice is based on data, not just our opinions. So we do a lot of actual primary research, and that's both interview and survey-based research to understand what's happening. Now, one of the areas that we felt was underserved in the research community was direct materials procure-to-pay. If you look at the indirect materials world, actually has gotten pretty good coverage, and a lot of it has to do with the rise of the procure-to-pay software companies in the late 90s that really focused on indirect, and I think that motivates a lot of the investment of the research community. So we did a survey of about 120 manufacturers and their direct materials procure-to-pay practices. I'm going to cover a lot of what we've learned recently and as well as over the years. So we'll get here and go to the next slide. Let's see if we can get this moving. Okay. There we go. Okay, so the agenda for today, we're going to start out in level set, make sure we're on the same page here on understanding the terminology, what is procure-to-pay, and specifically what is direct procure-to-pay and how it fits into the sourcing and procurement lifecycle. Then I'm going to talk to you about this concept of relationship intensity versus automation intensity, and that's something you probably have not heard of before, but we'll explain that in a minute. And then we'll dive into the 4 stages of direct procure-to-pay process, go through our survey results of the survey that I just described. And one of the things about procure-to-pay is it's very different across different companies. So you'll see that we actually classify 9 different types of solutions according to their heritage. And finally, we'll wrap up with how to get more value from procure-to-pay. So this may be a little basic for some of you, but just to make sure we're on the same page, looking at the sourcing and procurement lifecycle starts with, you source the contract. This is, of course, finding suppliers, first setting your sourcing strategy, finding those suppliers, sending out your RFQs if that's how you're going to negotiate with them, and then selecting a supplier. And ultimately, you end up with a contract that you're going to actually buy from. You've got your agreement. So now, once that's in place, this is where the rubber meets the road, the actual execution of the procurement, sending out your purchase orders, having them fulfilled by the supplier, receiving them, and then doing your payment. And of course, this diagram shows supplier management as sequentially after that, but it's actually happening in parallel with both the sourcing and the procurement of checking your supplier's performance and doing any corrective action that needs to be happened. So today, we're focusing on just this piece that starts with the issuing of the PO and goes all the way to the payment. It's the actual execution. So the other thing to make sure is that we're on the same page about the difference between direct and indirect spend. Direct spend is everything that goes into the object that a manufacturer is building. So in this case, we've got the example of an automobile. One moment, please. Okay, we've got an automobile, and the manufacturer of that buys all kinds of things, tires, engine, the seats, paint to go on it, and bolts. That was what we show here. All of that goes into the making of the car. But that same manufacturer, they need office supplies. They buy computers for their people and furniture and all kinds of services that might be legal services or a guy to mow your lawn. They're also buying all of that stuff. None of that ends up in the car, right? So that's called indirect, and that's how that division is. It's very important to understand because the two types of procurement are actually quite different. The direct procurement is really driven by a production planning cycle, usually an MRP system spitting out and telling you when to buy stuff, whereas indirect is generally driven by people filling out requisitions and saying, I'm out of pencils, I need more. That's one difference. The other difference is how much variety we see between industries. So if you think about someone who is doing procurement for a food company versus an aerospace company and versus, say, a chemicals company or a pharmaceutical company or high-tech, I mean, the components and the expertise and things like the lead times and what type of certifications you need, they're just so different between industries. Whereas indirect, buying pencils is the same whether you're an aerospace company or a chemicals company. The other thing is that indirect, there's time critical nature. In other words, you've got a production schedule, and if things don't arrive on time, at a minimum, you've now got to rejigger your schedule and build something else. Worst case, your line shuts down and you're not building until those components arrive. So that makes this a different category of criticality than I have my pencils arrived on time. And last but not least is the fact that the direct procurement tends to be performed not just in a procure-to-pay system, but also there are bits and pieces of it that are performed by other systems such as planning, quality, and transportation, and other systems around the company, whereas the indirect is largely performed within a single procure-to-pay system. This last statement is not a sort of black and white, but it's generally true. So I talked about there are 4 stages of direct materials procure-to-pay. The first is demand to confirmation. This is the actual placing of a purchase order and it getting a confirmation from the supplier that, yes, we can deliver it, or no, we can only deliver half on the date you want and the other half's on a future date, and then in that case there might be some negotiation about what you can do for me. The next stage, once the confirmation has happened, is the supplier actually builds the order, or if they're a built to stock, then they might just be built to forecast, excuse me, they might be just shipping from stock. And there may be some change management issues sometimes in that phase. Now you receive the stuff, potentially inspect it and accept it, or if there are quality issues, those quality issues have to be resolved. And finally, the invoice is sent. If everything matches, you pay. If everything doesn't match, you argue about it or try to get to the bottom of it and find out what the correct payment should be. So we're going to, in a moment, go into these in more detail to understand some of the nuances in those various phases. First, though, I want to cover this concept of relationship intensity versus automation intensity. So what we're talking about here, that a relationship intensity refers to, at each of these stages, when there's lots of exchanges between people. These, calling on the phone and trying to resolve issues or negotiating and figuring things out. It could be email, phone, texting, whatever those communications are. This is building on this relationship between 2 people or sometimes more than 2 people on either side of the relationship. On the other hand, there are certain things that you would like to automate, and these are, activities like, a simple example might be a PO is sent, and then there's an acknowledgement that I received the PO. There's no reason why a person should have to do that. If a machine can do it quicker, more reliably, and so forth. Same thing with even reconciling an invoice. If all of the data is in there in the various systems, then let's just check the invoice received and see if it matches what was originally ordered and received. So there's a lot of things that are potentially automatable in this process that don't require human beings to go back and forth or do things. And I say potentially because a lot of people are automating less than the potential is for them to do that. Excuse me. Okay, so just to put a little color on this and understanding, we'll talk about it in each phase. In the demand to confirm phase here, this is again where you're placing a PO and waiting for acknowledgement. When you have items that have very long lead times and constrained capacity, then there's often this negotiation that goes on around, what's the actual delivery date. Excuse me. And so that ends up being something that human beings have to do. It's hard to do that by machine. On the other end, when you have short lead time items, and especially when they're in stock, you hope that all that happens just automatically. Kind of the extreme case of that is vendor managed inventory. In this case, you're actually eliminating the whole process. You're saying, look, we're not even going to send you purchase orders. There'll be maybe a blanket PO to cover things over a period of time. But during that time, it's up to the vendor to monitor inventory levels and just replenish them without having to receive an order or confirm it. So let's look at this dichotomy 2 in the next phase here. And this is where you're actually building and delivering objects. On the bottom, if it's short lead time standardized stuff, you hope that just all happens automatically without a lot of dialogue going back and forth. On the other hand, if it's a big complex machine, like say a generator for a power plant, or some other piece of equipment on that scale, a lot of times that's going to take many months, maybe a year or more even to build that machine, and there can be a lot of changes that happen during that time, and change management and adjustments to specification, schedule, and price. And that, by necessity, is a very relationship-intensive activity. In the receiving and accepting process, generally you'd like this to go as automatically as automated as possible. But when there's a quality issue arises, then there has to be a lot of back and forth there. And finally, in this last phase, and I always say this is the phase where having a lot of manual back and forth discussions usually means you're trying to resolve some dispute about what is actually owed. And that is a totally non-value add use of everyone's time. And so the idea here is how can you get to, as close as you can to 100% error-free invoices and payments. We'll talk more about that a little later. So we're going to go into each of those 4 stages and put a little more, color on what people do and what are some good practices and so forth. So the demand to confirm phase, I said it starts with an order being sent. It actually starts before that with a forecast, ideally. And in some cases, that forecast may be informal, but more often it's a more formal forecast that's being shared. This is an important practice. The better the buyer can do at forecasting and sharing that in a timely manner with the seller, especially when things are changing from what you said before, the more likely that the seller is going to be able to perform well in actually delivering. In some cases, this forecast actually acts as an order or a material release as well. And in some industries, such as automotive, they'll have a 26-week rolling forecast, and when things come in inside of a certain time horizon, it becomes a firm order or material release that's instead of having a separate actual purchase order. And one of the things here we also show on the right, what's the source of this demand? What's kicking out these orders? And for a manufacturing company, they often have an MRP solution, which is telling you this is how long it takes to build things, and these are the lead times, and we're expecting to build. Our forecast says we need to build this many, and so we need to order this many of this on this time. So it's really being automated by the MRP system. But in other kinds of manufacturing, like we talked about the power plant, that power plant is being built not driven by an MRP system, but by a project management system. And so that project management system plays a similar kind of role, but in a very different way, understanding the interdependencies of the various people and materials, the lead times, and availability of equipment and expertise. And based on all of that, it's going to decide when things should be ordered. So it depends on your source there. The supplier then receives that order and decides whether they can commit to what was requested. And that may be a simple process. Go over to Joe and say, Joe, can we do this? Depending on the complexity of the company, it more likely would have some sort of planning system or at least a spreadsheet to figure it out. And then that's, of course, when a dialogue may happen when you can't meet the requested delivery quantities or dates. And, the longer the lead times, then the more likely that there's going to be some negotiation going on here. I think about, forgings in the aerospace industry that can be many months. Semiconductors where you see, 14 to 16-week lead times. And, one fellow I talked to who was in semiconductors said that there's actually a ton of negotiation that goes on right at this stage when you send your forecast, and there's a lot of horse trading about who's going to get what slots and so forth. And sometimes you can take one of your other products and say, well, push that one out and put this one in there. And what he told me is that all that negotiation actually happens before the PO is actually sent. So the PO just becomes a formality that says, here's what we agreed for the delivery time and date. So the next stage now is time to actually build and deliver. As I mentioned, if you build a forecast, it's already built, so you're just going to send it out. This is also where changes might get requested. So the frequency and the intensity of change management is really related to having longer lead times and higher complexity. And it could be caused by an end customer wanting changes. And what I mean by that is in these larger complex projects, you might have an engineering, procurement, and construction firm or an EPC firm that's actually managing the whole project and doing the procurement, but they're not the owner or the end user of the project. And so that end user or owner may say, hey, we've changed our mind on a couple things here, and that may trickle through to now the supplier via the EPC firm. So it could also be that the supplier is having some issues with the schedule and needs to push back or ask for changes on that. It can also be that actually as you're building this, a big complex machine on a site, you discover that some of your assumptions were wrong and you need to make changes. So for whatever reason, these changes can happen, and there's a lot of intense negotiations can happen. And this is where actually building a strategic relationship between the buyer and supplier teams can help a lot. And by that I mean if they've learned how to work together, so, a lot of times the supplier can come up with creative solutions to the problem that the buyer may not have thought of. And if it's a three-way, you might even include the customer in that. If the customer is asking for some change, then the supplier may say, well, if you can have this kind of flexibility, then we can do it for this much less money and on schedule. Whereas if you insist on having it this way, then there's no way we can do it without raising the price or blowing the schedule. So those kinds of negotiations will go on. The other thing I want to point out here is the visibility. You see where it says milestone reporting and advanced ship notice. For many industries, for some industries, that kind of visibility into the actual progress is really important. And we see, for example, even in apparel, they like to know that, hey, the cloth has been purchased and now it's been dyed, and we're on schedule to meet that fashion season that's critical for us. The other thing is the ASN. That's an important document that is not always done correctly or on time. And when that is incorrect, or when the shipping documentation is incorrect, then it just throws a monkey wrench into the whole works there. So working on ways to get those documents more accurate is really important to the efficiency, and not just saving, making things go faster, but saving everyone's time from figuring out why the data is wrong. So now we're ready to receive, and you'll notice it starts with some linkages like making a doc appointment schedule or sending the ASN. And normally these would be considered part of logistics, but they're clearly important to the procure-to-pay process. And how well the supplier performs these, as I talked about, the accuracy of the data is important. But also, if we talk about doc appointment scheduling, there's a buyer responsibility there. I've heard about cases where the supplier is unable to get a doc appointment, even though they called ahead of time, and then they get dinged for that, when really it's the buyer's operations that need improving there. So this is another area where performance can make a difference. Now, regarding the inspection of materials, if you have a strategic relationship with a supplier, then that's been built up over time, the performance and the trust and that the supplier will deliver, then it's typical that the supplier will do the inspection and the buyer just automatically receives without having to inspect. That's become more and more common, and that saves a lot of time and effort on the buyer side. This does take some investment in the relationship and making sure that you've got that kind of quality in your supplier, but it pays off with efficiencies. Now, one of the challenges there is that if you're not doing incoming inspection and there is a quality issue, it may not be discovered until later, and that can cause additional expenses like rework and so forth. And the actual resolution of the quality issues, this becomes a collaborative effort, or it can be a collaborative effort between the engineering sides of both sides. That would include the quality group, the manufacturing group, and so forth. It's another area that people would say, well, that quality is outside of the procure-to-pay process, but obviously it's deeply impacting the flow of goods when a part is on hold until an issue is resolved. And besides that, once a resolution is actually determined, the final result and the agreement that you've reached, that all has to be accurately communicated and actually entered into your procure-to-pay execution systems, so that the disposition of the materials already received is properly understood. So in other words, I got 100 of them. Are we rejecting all 100? Are we accepting a portion of those? Or are we accepting all of them, but conditionally they can only be used on machine A, but not on machine B? All of that needs to be understood. Was there a discount negotiated because of that, and so forth? If that's not accurately recorded, then at the time of the incident resolution, then it's just going to cause problems further down the road. So this linkage between the quality group and the resolution of issues and the procurement people and the procurement systems is another one of those important linkages. And I think it points out a point I'll repeat here a couple of times, which is the procurement group in the direct materials procure-to-pay needs to deal with a number of these other groups. We talked about logistics, we're talking about quality, and that cross-functional integration is a really important ingredient to success. Another example would be the quality group might issue an update to the specification, and that's obviously going to impact all future orders. So now we're at the last step here, which is your invoicing, and an invoice is sent. Hopefully it just matches and you're paid. And as I mentioned before, this is the one stage where it's really hard to justify a lot of manual interactions back and forth. The resolution of the disputes doesn't add value to anyone. It's purely an indicator that errors are being introduced somewhere in the procure-to-pay process. And in fact, some people I've talked to use the first pass error rate as a primary metric of their overall procure-to-pay success. So what they're saying is, any errors in there are showing that we've got places that we need to clean up in the process, and then let's go figure out what those are. So really the goal should be to get as close as possible to 100% automated payments error-free on the first pass. And I've talked to organizations, some fairly big ones, that actually with a right diligence, putting the right systems in place, and a very systematic approach with suppliers have actually achieved very, very close to zero defects in their procure-to-pay process, and very near that 100%. So it's actually possible. There are, a couple of secrets to success here. One of them is striving to have a single version of the truth between the supplier and the buyer. And this is really done by eliminating manual data entry throughout the process. So data gets entered once at the very beginning, maybe when the PO is issued, and then that data is used by the supplier for all their documents, and only when really new data is being added that doesn't exist in a system anywhere should there be any data entry. That should be the design goal of the end-to-end relationship. Now, obviously, the buyer doesn't always have control over how the supplier does things, but there are people that are working to help suppliers to automate their systems and to remove all that manual data entry. And to the extent that you can do that efficiently in a mass way with all your supply base, that's one way to drive errors out of the system. And in fact, helping your suppliers to automate so that any errors are caught and corrected at the point of execution is one of those best practices, or at least a better practice. And an example might be on the physical level is during picking and packing. If the supplier scans each item before the pack, then the system can catch any errors and say, wait a minute, it's the wrong item or the wrong quantity. Some suppliers will use scales to actually weigh the box and compare it against the expected weight as a double check that you've got the right things in the box. The other thing I'd point out here is that there are opportunities for financing programs at this stage, which might be an early payment discount program that could be funded by the buyer, or it might be funded by a third party. And there are people that have systems in place. And these can help both parties, because often the suppliers, especially if it's an overseas supplier, has a much higher cost of capital than the buyer. And so there's a kind of arbitrage there between what the buyer can do with their cash and what the supplier is paying for cash. And if you're large enough and you've got the volumes to justify this, I'd recommend taking a look at those kinds of programs. We'll talk for a minute about the survey results. I'm going to just show you 3 slides here. We actually asked a lot more questions, but again, this was 120 manufacturers asking them about their procure-to-pay processes. One of the questions was how automated are those processes? As you can see, the middle of the bell curve here is in a 10 to 25% of the direct spend is automated. A lot of room for improvement in automating. And that's not just about saving time, it's about saving time in doing the manual process. It's about eliminating errors as well. And so we also asked what kind of systems are used. A lot of people use their ERP system, the purchasing tools built into that. That's very common. It's also very common, this was a check all that apply question. So it's also very common to have manual processes in addition. And some people are using imaging systems or homemade systems out there, and they're best of breed systems. Now this slide here, this was a forced ranking question about how you measure success in procure-to-pay. What are the key performance indicators? So they were presented with a list of choices and asked to say, what's your most important KPI, what's your second most, and what's your third most? So that's what this color coding is here, how many people answered for each one. This is my most important one, this is my second, and this is my third. These are percentages here, not numbers. And so as we can see that the two most important areas were spend reduction and supplier performance. We find this interesting because those tend to be the goals for an overall sourcing and procurement program. The Procure-to-Pay, the actual execution piece, has less influence on these than the sourcing and supplier management pieces. So, if you think about spend reduction, really your spend analytics, your sourcing strategy, and your negotiations with the supplier, that's where you get a lot of the spend reduction, especially for direct. In indirect, there's opportunities for spend reduction in maverick spend. That's people who are spending off contract and saying, yeah, you got that great contract, I don't care, I got my favorite Joe down the street I'm going to buy from. So in indirect, there is actually a greater opportunity to impact spend reduction than in direct. Not that there isn't maverick buying in direct as well, but there tends to be more discipline in the organization. On the supplier performance side, that's generally going to be improved. Well, the role that Procure-to-Pay has in influencing supplier performance is the actual measurement of the performance. Did it come on time? Were there defects? And did you have all the proper documentation? And all of those things go into measuring supplier performance. But actually influencing supplier performance is done outside that process. You might have a quarterly review. You might have a dashboard somewhere that is showing the supplier their performance and so forth. The things that are more directly influenced by Procure-to-Pay are these, the actual operational cost and productivity. How much is it costing me per transaction, per invoice, and per purchase order? And those are things that you can really drive down through automating your Procure-to-Pay program and getting efficiencies. The same thing with cycle times, and this is a really important one because the more time you can squeeze out of the system, the more competitive that makes your company, the more agile you become and able to meet changing circumstances. And then we did already talk about first pass accuracy and invoice automation as metrics or automatic reconciliation as metrics to measure, especially the first pass accuracy and throughput. That's a good measure of our errors being introduced into the system. Okay, so we're on the home stretch here. I'm going to talk for a minute about the different types of direct materials solutions out there. And this is really about the heritage of different solutions and kind of heritage and architecture, I'd say. And you'll see that these are not mutually exclusive, but it's a way to think about the different systems. As I mentioned before, the indirect Procure-to-Pay tends to be a cohesive. I've got one indirect system that, and it'll often integrate with the ERP system, or it might be actually part of the ERP system. But I issue my requisitions through that, the approval workflows within this. What I'm talking about indirect right now, and we receive it, and the payment is made all in that one system. When we talk about direct, there's an involvement of a lot of different systems, and there are different approaches to skinning that animal, so to speak. So a lot of times these purchasing tools are built into the ERP system. As we saw, that's one of the most popular ways to get this done. The advantage here is that it's well integrated. It's sort of automatically pre-integrated with the MRP system that's part of that ERP solution, and the receiving and the financial portion, the accounting and payment. It's all integrated together, so that's really the plus of that. We've also got full suite sourcing and procurement suites. Sometimes this would be called best of breed, and those tend to have these components you here see, starting with the analytics, the sourcing components, managing contracts, Procure-to-Pay, and supplier management. And we find that a lot of these were born in the, say, late 90s or early 2000s, really with a focus on indirect, to solve that requisition-driven indirect Maverick spend problem. So a lot of them were originally designed without much consideration for direct materials and the different challenges that you see in direct, as we laid out earlier. And that's still the case for many of them. We do see there's a handful out there that were specifically designed for direct materials, and some that are making that transition as we speak. A variation on that theme is when someone actually provides outsourced procurement services. Now, it's very common in indirect that someone might say, hey, we'll take over all your indirect procurement services. That, again, as I mentioned, that tends to work across industries. However, direct is a lot more, there's a lot more industry expertise. You need especially when you talk about the sourcing piece. You know, I'm going to help, I've got a commodity expert in steel or in semiconductors or what, you know, in some specialty chemicals. And so the outsourcing tends to be in the sourcing part of the service, but oftentimes they'll add on to that and say, and we'll do the procurement as well, right? We'll issue the purchase orders and track progress and you know, do some reconciliation type activities. So when the companies that do that, they almost always have their own software platform. It may be from a third party, but a lot of them have developed their own platform, and some of them even will sell that platform separately without the procurement services. And in that case, those platforms actually can look similar to number 2 above. The fourth kind of system you'll see out there is a network-based, and this is where you have a network of buyers and suppliers that the onboarding happens just once, and then once you're hooked up, then you can start communicating with everyone on the network. So if I'm a supplier, I integrate once, and now I've got any buyers that on the network can buy from me. Now that last statement about integrating once, you take with a little bit of grain of salt. It means that things that are common across all your buyers only has to be done once. There still may be buyer-specific configuration things that need to happen. I want to point out that solutions can be, these are not mutually exclusive. For example, you know, Ariba has a sourcing and procurement suite, and they also have a buyer-supplier network that can use that suite. So that will be one example. And these tend to be rich on buyer side functionality and often thin on supplier side. These networks are often really designed for buyers in terms of you know, deep functionality, and suppliers is just you know, to have them self-discovered and just participate, often either via EDI or a portal. But there are some that are actually have some pretty rich supplier side tools. Alemica is one in chemicals industry, and in those cases, the supplier side actually looks like some sort of customer. I wouldn't call it a CRM system because it's not about, you know, sales and lead tracking, but they have a lot of customer-facing supply chain management functionality in them. The next type is automation platforms, and again, these are not mutually exclusive. The sourcing and procurement suites and some ERP systems they're really designed to automate functions. But what I'm saying here is that there are some procure-to-pay systems whose purpose in life is to automate both sides of the equation. And I think one of the things here is that a lot of these other platforms will attempt to automate buyer functions. The question is, how well are you automating the supplier side? And it's not just about doing an EDI integration. It's about actually trying to drive out the manual data entry from your supplier processes and catch errors at the point of execution, and do it in a scalable way that can, you know, a scalable way that that you can bring the major portion of your supply base on board. There are systems out there that will do workflow and B2B integration, so or BPM, business process management. These are systems that are really, they're quite horizontal, and they're made to say we can solve any problem. You know, you can design it by putting your workflow together on our system. And some of these systems will have pre-built templates or pre-built workflows for procure-to-pay and integrations, and some of them have spent quite a bit of effort to do that. I mentioned before about complex projects, large complex projects that they're not using an MRP system, and so these project management tools often have some sort of P2P capabilities in them, or I should say sometimes have. So these are large, they tend to be integrated with your CAD systems, and the material releases are driven by your project schedule. They also often have some very significant tools to help you with change management, tracking changes, not just version control, but collaboration design between the designers on each side, even simulators and things like that help to see the impact of changes. There are platforms out there that provide visibility as their core value proposition, and again, this is an example of one that people can fit in multiple categories. So I think of GT Nexus, which some people think of as a logistics system, but it's also a procure-to-pay system, and it provides you this visibility. And so, and it's also a many-to-many network. So visibility is really about tracking from your order to settlement, and people who have a need, as I mentioned, for visibility into actual production milestones on their supplier's floor. And this could be done through a portal where the supplier enters things, but in advanced cases, you actually might hook into some of the supplier's systems so that you can keep track of things. And of course, the logistics visibility becomes important for international shipments. We've got these multiple stages, has it arrived at the port, when is it going to arrive at the destination, and so forth. I do want to take a second to talk about supply chain finance. We talked about the post-invoice financing where you could do an early payment discount program or provide some way for the supplier to get financing based on the receivables. But once you have this kind of visibility system in place, you can also do pre-shipment finance. And this is a way to help suppliers out. And what I mean by this is when you've got visibility into exactly where things are and the past performance of your suppliers and how they've done, that can help reduce risk for lenders tremendously. And so then that means that lenders can get onto a platform like this and actually provide financing to suppliers before they've shipped or while it's in transit, and if they've got a firm purchase order in hand, and at a much lower rate than those suppliers are used to getting. And that lowers the cost for everyone. Last but not least, there are some platforms that really started life as invoice management networks or platforms. And this would include, of course, the invoicing, the reconciliation, and the actual payment, and they kind of stretch their boundaries to become a P2P platform. So as you're looking at your choices out there, it depends on what problem you're trying to solve, and there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, as they say. Okay, we got one more slide here on how to get more value out of your procure-to-pay, direct materials procure-to-pay. So the first point here is, we've talked about a lot of different things, and what's really important to your company. Do you have these big complex change management issues that tend to bog down, or on the other hand, do your suppliers are introducing lots of errors, and there's an opportunity to automate them and get rid of those errors? Is there an opportunity to automate your own systems there with strategic relationships and do some sort of evaluated receipts, get rid of invoicing altogether? Just taking a look at where those opportunity points are, and also where your greatest pain points are. Where are you really behind the curve? Or it's not always about what's the biggest bang for the buck originally, but you might have some low-hanging fruit, and by that I mean it's easier to do and get some quick results before you tackle the really big, hard problems. We talked about technology. It's important to take a look at what you can do with technology to improve in addition to people and processes. And it doesn't mean necessarily buying something new. A lot of people dramatically underuse what they already have or not using it to the maximum benefit. But you also might want to look, sometimes you can justify bringing in new technology. The cross-functional integration here refers to, we talked about the fact that the procurement group, the better job you do working with and bringing in not just sourcing, but also logistics and quality and all these different groups, the better the overall performance is going to be. So you should see yourself as this kind of a hub in the spokes of the wheel that really brings a lot of this together and working with them. Last but not least is motivating the organization to make these changes. And a lot of people, they may get bogged down into and not understand the value, the potential of improving the performance of a procure-to-pay within the organization. So really, showing people that they can make a difference becomes really important. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
All right, yeah, and please do use the Q&A block that you'll see to the right of the slides here. We'd love to have your questions, and we do have a couple that have come in already, Bill, so let me just jump into those. The first one, what is an average acceptable price variance on the PO versus invoice for a manufacturing company?
Yeah, that's a kind of a difficult question because there's a lot of variance between industries in what's acceptable and commodities. So it really depends on what you're buying, and so it's also an area we haven't done a survey in yet. So my answer would be more opinion-based than based on actual data. But the challenge there again is the variance. It depends on what industry and what commodity you're buying.
Would it help if the person who asked the question maybe chime back in with a little more of that data?
That would be something that we could probably help with offline, because as I mentioned, we haven't done that particular survey yet.
All right. There was also a couple of people. There were a couple of people asking about access to the slides, and I'll just mention that we are recording today's session, and we'll make that available. But Bill, is there any option for getting access to these slides or some version of them in the future?
Yeah, I think we could make a PDF of that available.
Okay. Would it make sense for? Okay, and we can let everyone know how to get that access later.
Yeah, you can contact me directly if you want a copy of that. That's probably the simplest way.
All right, perfect. So we would love to hear more from the folks in the audience about what they're thinking about with regard to direct materials, procure-to-pay. Are you looking at a particular area where you can improve efficiency? Are you do those KPIs that Bill mentioned before line up with your goals? Bill, I did want to ask, when there's a focus on spend reduction and supplier performance, if those are the most popular, some of the most popular areas. And you mentioned that sometimes that's maybe a little bit of a mismatch with some of the top benefits that you can realize. Or sometimes you're finding that companies' expectations maybe are not met, or that there's a mismatch there when they've made the investment and they look at the ROI?
Yeah, no, I think in that part of our survey, what I believe was happening there is, even though we're talking about procure-to-pay, when you ask somebody what's your top KPIs, they tend to think about what are they being measured on, overall, and that could be across the sourcing, procurement, and supplier management functions, and so. Those two we do find when you talk about KPIs in sourcing and procurement, in general, those always pop up. Obviously, spend reduction, right? You're always being beat over the head to reduce costs. That's seen as sort of the number one goal for a procurement organization. So that's not surprising. And then supplier performance is also very important for most organizations. They want to make sure that they're continually working strategically with their suppliers or in different ways to improve performance. So I think it's more a matter of people thinking about that question in a broader context rather than thinking that they can solve those problems just within the procure-to-pay phase of their job.
All right, and if someone was thinking about improving some of these capabilities and they were looking at sort of the state of their enterprise solutions right now, are there some key integrations that you would tend to be asking an organization to describe in terms of what integrations they already have, what capabilities they can already support when they're going to assess where they might go next? Yeah,
so I think in looking, I think it gets back to this question of, as I mentioned in the last slide there, is where are the points of leverage or points of value for you? And so if you deal with these large complex projects or long lead times items, you may want to focus on the change management tools there. And something like that starts to go outside of what we'd normally consider procure-to-pay. It could be looking at your engineering collaboration environment and tools and so forth. If you're having issues with quality issues, again, you want to work on solving those quality issues, but you also may look at the linkages between your quality system and your procurement system to make sure that the data is coming from those between those two systems, in a more automated and reliable way, rather than relying on manual data entry. So it really depends on your particular industry and your particular pain points.
How are the challenges of automating P2P different across regions of the world, say U.S. versus Europe?
Yeah, so I think that part of I think you might see a different, an even bigger difference with Asia, in the sense that it partly depends on automating your supply base is an important piece of the equation. When you talk about driving out errors, that's the most challenging part, I believe, is getting your suppliers to reduce their rate of errors from manual data entry. So if you look in the Far East, the suppliers, this is a generalization now, so there certainly are lots of exceptions, but in general, you might find more suppliers with who are less far along in their technology curve, and so that may be a little more heavy lifting in terms of getting your supply base automated, depending on the region. And of course, language barrier can also come into play there as well.
All right. Well, that ends our question queue here. I'll make a last, maybe a last call for any remaining questions as we start to wrap up. Today's session has been recorded. We'll be making it available on demand. Bill, I just wanted to extend our thanks for you joining us and sharing this new research with us. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, everyone in the audience, for the questions and for your attention. Thanks, and have a great day.